If you're really going to see Wimbledon, but you tell Fox you're going to cover
Wait, I didn't hear. What did you?
Yeah, you're going to Wimbledon, and you're like, I'm covering the
I don't have any tickets to anything. Do you realize I'm not a tourist. I just go, work, sleep, go home. That's basically. I go to dinner. I do eat. Home. I hope there's a good restaurant there.
All right, Sean, stay safe. Great show tonight. Good evening from Washington. I'm Laura Ingraham. This is the Ingraham Angle. We have a mesmerizing menu of stories to bring to you tonight. And as the left melts down over Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court, runaway judges are striking fresh blows against the Trump agenda. Plus, is California Senator Kamala Harris the female Obama in waiting for 2020? We're going to debate that with someone who ran in her California circles, knows her well, and how President Trump plans to use America First to make a big splash at tomorrow's NATO summit. But first, Kavanaugh, Democrats, and dinosaurs. That's the focus of tonight's angle. Watching the reaction of Democrats to the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the High Court is likely to give you ulcers. Their anger and unhinged rants are one part dystopian drama, one part just plain old sour grapes. Kavanaugh, a federal judge who's occupied the bench for over a dozen years and written hundreds of decisions, is a man who is really scary because he coaches his daughter's basketball team and volunteers in soup kitchens. Well, he's now being derided as a total monster because of how he might rule on abortion, Obamacare, and gun rights. Actress Julianne Moore tweeted, "Please, we must send the Senate a clear message. This country cannot afford a justice on the Supreme Court who is likely to support the gun lobby's extreme, absolutist interpretation of the Second Amendment. Message your senators now." Alyssa Milano, still ticked that Trump's the boss, tweeted, "Brett Kavanaugh is just one case attacked women's rights, health care, and immigration. He's the trifecta of terrible, and he must never sit on the Supreme Court." But it was This Is Us director Ken Olin who tweeted my favorite and arguably the most ignorant comment of the night. At least he admits his ignorance, writing, "I don't know what kind of judge Brett Kavanaugh is, but he and all of the other white and in many cases old folks at the event look so out of date, so out of sync with what the world is becoming, what the world needs to become. At last gasp of the way life was in the past. Sad for us." Well, so this Is Us director believes that old white people are apparently not us. Okay, well, we're glad we got that straight. Well, Hollywood is not the only community reeling from the Kavanaugh nomination. The shock could be seen on the faces and heard in the voices of the left-wing establishment. Now, don't tell Ken Olin, but many of the liberals you're about to see are, in fact, white and, in many cases, old.
President Trump, with the nomination of Judge Kavanaugh, has fulfilled or is fulfilling two of his campaign promises. First, to undo women's reproductive freedom. Second, to undo ACA. And so I will oppose him with everything I've got.
He very well could be the deciding vote in whether or not a criminal prosecution against the president goes forward. But this is a president right now who hears the hoofbeats of an investigation that is bearing down on him.
And to avoid a constitutional crisis, we cannot let this confirmation process go forward.
Did Elizabeth Warren say hoofbeats? Well, the last time I saw this many dinosaurs on fire, Chris Pratt was running from them. Well, voters may soon be doing the same. You got to watch these people. They're totally nuts. But did you hear what Cory Booker said there? "We cannot let this confirmation process go forward." Do you remember any conservative talking in those terms when Barack Obama nominated Elena Kagan or, for that matter, Sonia Sotomayor to the Supreme Court? The answer is no. So go ahead, critique a nominee's legal reasoning. That's fine. Question his or her view of the Constitution. Totally fine. But to adopt an Antifa-like resistance that seeks to block the process at all costs or weaponize it is just absurd. The truth is, for all the histrionics, Brett Kavanaugh would have been a natural choice for pretty much any Republican president. He served on the second most important court in the country for more than a decade and is widely respected in legal circles. And he's widely liked, by the way, among Democrats and Republicans, Democrat appointees and Republican. And his nomination to the high court, it's hardly a radical change. In 81 years, think about this, only 3 men have held this seat. Justice Hugo Black, Justice Lewis Powell, and Justice Anthony Kennedy. Now, Justice Thomas replacing Thurgood Marshall. Now, that was a big swing, but this is basically a slightly more conservative nominee replacing a generally conservative justice in Anthony Kennedy. The big change is that for the first time, though, since the 1930s, the court could have a reliable conservative majority. That's big. And this partially explains why some Democrats are just going completely bonkers today. To block Kavanaugh, Dems are even trotting out a new tactic. I loved seeing this unfold today. They now want to force nominees to answer how they would rule on hypothetical cases. Now, this is all meant to pin down a nominee on hot-button issues. Here's Senator Richard Blumenthal.
You know, we have heard these phony platitudes again and again and again. We heard them from Neil Gorsuch. We heard them from now Chief Justice Roberts. These evasive, canned, rehearsed answers are absolutely meaningless. No more business as usual. No more deferential or courteous acceptance of these phony platitudes.
A man who knows something about platitudes. Well, Chuck Schumer's head seems to be in the same place. Here he is on the Senate floor from yesterday.
President Trump will only select a nominee who will undermine protection for Americans with pre-existing conditions, give greater weight to corporate interests, and vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. The next nominee has an obligation, a serious and solemn obligation, to share their personal views on these legal issues.
So now an impartial jurist is expected to prejudice his opinions and forecast his views during the confirmation process? Only a year ago, Schumer was singing a much different tune.
You can't ask a judge who's nominated for or a potential judge who's nominated for a judgeship about a specific case that might come before them.
Okay, so what's changed? Well, probably this. A new Axios poll of registered voters showing Democrats losing 3 Senate seats while picking up 2 currently held by Republicans. What's the translation? The Democrats will still be in the minority. That's when Chuck's glasses fall right off the bridge of his nose. Now, in the meantime, they'll do whatever they can to try to turn out their base. They're desperate to do that. So the Senate seems to be slipping away. So even if it means slashing away at perfectly competent, very accomplished Supreme Court pick like Brett Kavanaugh, creating this viral drama from the hearing room, they're going to do whatever they can. But my sense is when the dust settles, these dinosaurs will be presiding over a fallen kingdom all of their own. And that's the angle. Joining me now for reaction are 2 esteemed attorneys. Saul Weisenberg was the deputy independent counsel during the investigations into Bill Clinton, knows Brett Kavanaugh, and Scott Bolden is a Democrat and chair of the National Bar Association Political Action Committee. Great to see you. Let's start with you, Scott.
Sure.
I think it's completely fair game for the Senate use their constitutional responsibility seriously, question Kavanaugh's judicial philosophy, his approach to the Constitution, and ask him about past cases. That's what you should do in your process of reviewing these nominees. But what you heard from Chuck Schumer is something quite different. He's now demanding, contrary to what he said 1 year ago, 1 year and 3 months ago, that nominees must say how they're going to rule on certain hot-button cases. What is that all about?
Or their philosophies. Listen,
that's not what he said,
this is all about Obamacare. This is all about abortion or Roe v. Wade, and it's all about whether this justice nominee believes that the president can either be prosecuted or subpoenaed and what have you. These are not hot button issues for the Democrats. These are real issues. And when you take the gloves off in those Senate hearings, if you look at maybe the last 5 to 10 that have been published or that we've seen, you've got non-answers, you've got questions that skirt the issue. The Democrats, and I think some Republicans, are going to come out and say, tell me what your feelings or thoughts are on Roe v. Wade. When he went to the D.C. Circuit, Justice Kavanaugh, when he went to the D.C. Circuit, he said he would follow Roe v. Wade. But that was a mix, because the problem with that is he was going to the D.C. Circuit. Now he's going to be on the Supreme Court. Why shouldn't we be able to ask him his feelings on Roe v. Wade now?
Well, for one, Ruth Bader Ginsburg at her confirmation hearing was very concerned about being asked specific questions. Chuck Schumer, among many other Democrats, when we had Kagan up, when we had Sotomayor up, Democrats were in unison.
Different place.
Well,
different time, different place. And you're about to shift this court to the right right now.
I actually think you're wrong about that. And a lot of conservatives are probably not going to be happy to hear this. I think you guys ought to be really thanking yourselves, thanking this president that he nominated someone like Kavanaugh, who is he is to the right, probably a little bit of Kennedy, but the idea that Brett Kavanaugh is going to radically, move to take the first abortion case and overturn Roe, I don't see that.
Well, he's done violence and prior opinions to all three of those areas. The first thing, but here's the thing: when you use hysterics and what have you, what about the Justice Crisis Network, who's going to spend $10 million supporting Kavanaugh? Judicial,
right?
Call it what
ACLU,
you want. It's $10 million.
Well, the left is doing the same thing. You saw
no, not $10 million.
The best Saul.
Why are the Democrats hysterical, but the Justice Crisis Network isn't?
Watching their flank. That's why. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, you guys just want them to be, unilateral disarmament. Let's go to Saul
and Democrats have challenges.
Yeah, the left wants Republicans to go into this confirmation fight, Saul, without offering any defense of this candidate, of this judicial nominee. They have made this about legislating from the bench, because that's what they want the court to do. They want the court to legislate new rights into the Constitution that the framers never intended. Richard Blumenthal, I want to share something with you, Saul, that he said today. I could not believe what I was hearing and the snarly way that he said it. Let's watch.
Judge Kavanaugh, you don't belong in this building as a justice. My colleagues should be a no on this nominee unless Judge Kavanaugh specifically commits that he will recuse himself on any issues that involve President Trump's personal financial dealings or the special counsel.
Okay, Saul, explain that one for us, please.
Well, there's absolutely no basis for it. There's no basis in ethics or history for the concept that you can't rule on a case involving a president if he happened to have appointed you. Now, Rehnquist, if you recall, recused himself from the Watergate tapes case, but that's because he was a member of the Nixon administration and a high official in the Justice Department. But it's just ridiculous, and you're going to hear more of this kind of stuff. And you're right, Laura. Really, I've got no problem with people opposing a judicial candidate because they oppose his constitutional philosophy or her constitutional philosophy. But the Democrats don't want to play that game, because then they would have to admit in public hearings that really they believe the court should just enshrine their notion of progressivism into the Constitution. They really can't win an argument based on textualism and originalism, and so they have to come up with these phony issues, and that's what you're going to see, and it's going to be very brutal, and it's going to involve a lot of falsehoods, and the conservatives just have to, Republicans have to stay the course. That's all there is to it.
But Saul, why shouldn't the Democrats and the Republicans be able to ask about specific issues regarding his view on Roe v. Wade? Why shouldn't they be able to ask about his views on immigration and his prior cases that he's decided in the D.C. Circuit? That's not shenanigans. That's doing real good cross-examination, direct examination to get a feel for what this next justice is going to be. That's not shenanigans at all. That's real discussion to know what's going on.
Because, Scott, Because, Scott, there's been a rule that's been followed for decades that a judicial candidate should not opine on something, on a specific issue that may come before him or her. And it's gone on with both parties for at least the last 50 years. And by the way,
I don't know of any rule like that.
There's a lot of hypocrisy, and there's a lot of hypocrisy in Washington. But there's no area full of more hypocrisy than judicial selection. As Laura pointed out when she quoted Schumer from Justice Ginsburg's nomination fight, the parties totally changed positions depending on whose ox is being gored about what you can ask. Now, the fact is it's absolutely fair game. It's absolutely fair game to get into questions of judicial philosophy, and you can find out a lot about a candidate when you do that, but it's not fair game to ask them how they're going to rule on something.
Well, what did Brett say?
But that's not what I said.
What did Brett say last night? What did Judge Kavanaugh say last night? He said, I will approach every case with an open mind, an independent view of the judiciary, which I think is, most people believe that's what the court should be. We don't want a court, a Supreme Court, that acts like it's the super legislature on these issues that Congress can't, either state legislatures or the Congress can't get its act together on, whether it's immigration or any of these other social issues. Let those percolate up through the states and be handled in due course. You see, after 45 years of Roe versus Wade, the issue is not settled. The country is still roiling over 50 million babies being killed in the womb because of this sacrosanct right that was emanating out of penumbras in the Constitution. That didn't work, and I think that's what the left wants to keep going. Didn't work. I want to play one more thing for you, Scott, though. One more thing. This was Feinstein on Kavanaugh's view of the Second Amendment. Let's watch.
Because the issue of gun safety is so important to me, I want to mention how extreme Kavanaugh's views are in this area. He argued in 2011 against Washington, D.C.'s ban because weapons like AR-15s are in, quote, common use.
Kavanaugh's views on the Second Amendment are straight out of the gun lobby playbook.
I mean, again, this is the most facile way of looking at case law. Do you know the case he's talking about, the Heller case?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, do you know what Brett actually wrote in that case? Are you aware of it?
Don't test my memory, but I've read the opinion several times.
Okay, he said our task is to apply the Constitution. We have the full screen and precedents of the Supreme Court, regardless of whether the result is one we agree with as a matter of first principles or policy. That was the 2011 case following on from Heller. He's applying the Heller case. The fact that they don't like AR-15s, which are one of the most commonly owned guns in the United States, long guns in the United States, that's fine. California has rules against that. But as a matter of constitutional law, Scott, it's very different than being a legislator.
But you conflate the issues.
No, I separate the branches of government, Scott.
I do too. But you conflate the issues in this regard. If you're going to be ruling on abortion issues, why should I not be able to ask you, what are your professional feelings or your thoughts on Roe v. Wade?
Feelings don't matter for a judge. Your feelings don't matter as a judge.
Well,
the Constitution matters.
Okay, his thoughts.
His judicial philosophy.
Parts of it already.
His judicial philosophy is well known.
And that's all I hear from those senators, that they disagree with his rulings or they disagree with what his lower court rulings or writings have been. That's fair game.
Saul, final word. Will he get confirmed, yes or no, do you think, in the end?
Oh, he'll definitely get confirmed. But, you know, the real question about Roe versus Wade that he clearly can't be asked is, I don't care what you thought about Roe versus Wade when it was decided in 1973. The question is whether or not it should remain valid law if a case comes before the court. And everyone would agree that's just something you can't ask somebody who's a judicial nominee.
But I can
and
ask
you'll have to try to glean it from his writings.
Right, we can't prejudice future cases. Fantastic segment to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. And while the left goes to extraordinary lengths to paint Kavanaugh as, really a monster, we expose the actual threats inside our court system when Andy McCarthy and Judge Mike Mukasey join us next. Media are in an absolute panic, meltdown, case of the vapors mode over Trump's Supreme Court nominee. There are federal judges right at this moment undermining the president's agenda. The latest example, Los Angeles-based U.S. District Court Judge Dolly G., an Obama appointee, and that rhymes. On Monday, she rejected the Trump administration's request to allow children who are illegal immigrants to be detained together with their parents. Now, Judge G called the Trump administration's filing a, quote, cynical attempt to undo a longstanding court settlement that prohibits children caught at the border from being detained longer than 20 days. But is it? And are federal judges overstepping their bounds by essentially legislating from the bench? One judge can affect national policy or bring policy to a total standstill. Here now to explain further is former federal prosecutor and Fox News contributor Andy McCarthy. Andy, this Flores settlement that we've talked about for quite some time continues to haunt the immigration stance of this president, specifically this problem of family units or people posing as family units crossing the border and thinking they'll just be released into the country. Trump and Sessions wanted to put an end to that, but now they're up against the same federal district court judge that had shut down this process before for Obama. Where are we here?
Yeah, it's a real tough problem, Laura, although I would say, as far as this judge is concerned, that far, I think, from a cynical attempt to undermine the law, I think what the Trump administration tried to do here was get this reversed the right way, which would be to go to the court and go back to the litigation where this settlement was originally entered. The fact that they didn't succeed was predictable, but I do think they did it the right way and the honorable way. The problem here really is this is a terrible abdication by Congress, and it's a great example of what happens when you legislate through litigation. So basically what we need is Congress to say, here are the rules and the conditions of confinement, the conditions of detention that should apply to minor aliens. They won't do that. So they delegate it to the Justice Department, and what we end up having is these activist litigations where there's a discovery of substantive due process rights of minor children to a certain level of treatment when they're here. I think as humane people, we can all sympathize with that and agree with it, but it's not an adult policy if you're going to say, we're going to give these people these rights, and we're not going to provide the physical infrastructure that you need to carry it out.
Yeah, so Andy, the court has, though, you're right. I mean, the shifting responsibility from Congress, they already should have dealt with this. You should be able to deport people at an expeditious manner at the border who cross the border illegally to non-contiguous countries and so forth. But at the same time, this judge is taking it upon herself and to undo what this administration is trying to do. And I think an activist, this is an example of what happens when an activist judge gets a hold of a hot button issue like this. Most Americans listening to this conversation tonight are thinking to themselves, wait a second, illegal immigrants have constitutional rights? And if so, what rights? How far do they extend? Do they get court interpreters? Do they get lawyers paid for? Do they get to go to school and get entertainment while they're in custody? I mean, I think for most Americans, they think the whole thing is a little odd, given the fact that they're illegally here.
Laura, that's exactly the problem, because if Congress had dealt with this in an adult way, we'd have answers to all those questions. And instead, it's as it floated up in litigation. And the fact of the matter is, the Supreme Court in the early 1990s assumed, as did the Justice Department, that they have substantive due process rights to a certain level of humane detention here. And then they basically say, you guys now work it out.
Figure it out.
And the problem is, back in 1997, when this decree was entered, which now has the force of law, the problem was one level. Now it's like it's geometrically a bigger issue than it was before, and we don't have the infrastructure we need to address it.
No, it's absurd. Now, Andy, I'm going to ask Judge Mukasey, the former Attorney General, also, but I want your take on this. It's very important. What is happening to Paul Manafort, Trump's former, and briefly, he was the campaign manager for the campaign. Manafort is now being held in solitary confinement, 23 out of 24 hours a day, as he's trying to prepare for his trial on tax and bank fraud charges. No collusion, none of that, but it's tax and bank fraud. And his lawyers are saying he's being held in a Virginia prison cell, and it was in rural Virginia, in Warsaw, Virginia. I've driven past that, through that town. And he's 23 hours a day in solitary confinement.
Yeah, Laura, it's very highly unusual in a white-collar case like this to detain somebody prior to trial. They say he was tampering with witnesses. They persuaded the district court that that was the case. The problem is, once you have somebody who's high profile like him, if a judge actually does put him in pre-trial, that is, put him in custody rather than allow him to be out on bail, it's very hard for him to be in general population. So it's almost a given that if you find that he has to be detained, he's going to be detained in these very arduous conditions.
Yeah, well, where's the ACLU? Andy, thank you so much for that. Now let's bring in Judge Mike Mukasey, former U.S. Attorney General. Judge, I want to get your take on this because as someone who is a former white-collar criminal defense attorney myself, I cannot think of an occasion on which one of my clients was even close to being put in solitary confinement 2 weeks before, fairly complex litigation in preparing for this. His lawyers are saying it's much more difficult to prepare for the defense. What is going on here?
Well, apparently what happened is they brought, the government alleged, apparently adduced some evidence to the effect that he was contacting witnesses. And so they got the judge to revoke bail. Once he was turned over to the Bureau of Prisons, the Bureau of Prisons made the decision that if you put him in general population, he's going to be an attractive target for the kinds of people who are in general population. Bear in mind, this man hasn't been convicted of anything. So to protect him and to protect the Bureau of Prisons against liability, they put him in solitary confinement. But this is totally unnecessary.
Well,
people, it is not rocket science to have somebody in a detention situation outside a prison, home detention, and similar kinds of detention, in which he can't get access to a computer or to a telephone. There are people who are convicted of dealing in child pornography who are out and about, who get restrictions on their access to computers and so on. This can be done. It is not rocket science. And it would not be rocket science to put Paul Manafort in a setting outside a prison in which his access to a telephone may be restricted, may be monitored, and so on. It's just, this is unnecessary.
Now, and where's the ACLU? I mean, the ACLU has issued the most, condemnatory statements about solitary confinement, that it's essentially its own type of cruel and unusual punishment. A lot of the people on the left want to get rid of it altogether. But, you don't hear peep from them on this case. But, Judge, I want to move on to both Brett Kavanaugh briefly and this idea of a single judge, federal district court judge, something that Justice Thomas wrote about at the end of the term, and one of the big cases, the travel ban case. One judge being able to put an injunction in place that stops a president's policy, whether it's on immigration or on a broad variety of other issues. First, on that issue, how problematic is this today with the federal district court judges?
It's enormously problematic because it's become very much in style for judges to grant blanket injunctions that purport to apply nationwide on the theory that, well, the case before them is very much like the case that is faced elsewhere, and so they're going to apply the rule that they decide to all cases that are similar in all jurisdictions. That procedure is, as Justice Thomas pointed out, ripe for challenge, and I expect that in the coming term we'll see it challenged.
Well, I'm not to toot the horn of my old boss, but I'm so glad he wrote that in his concurrence, because it's long overdue that be examined. Now, I have to play this for you. This is Keith Ellison from Minnesota, who was speaking. I guess he was back in his home state yesterday, on Monday, and he was talking about the Supreme Court nominee. Didn't know who it was then, but already talking possible impeachment. Let's watch.
I will say that there have been lower court judges that have been impeached. Right. And honestly, there were some things that came out with Justice Thomas that I thought were very concerning to me in terms of his impartiality. And so I agree with Jill. It probably is not going to happen, but it could theoretically happen.
So I don't know if you could hear that, Judge, but
it's hard to hear.
Basically saying, all bets are off. I mean, probably won't happen, but it could. What about that?
Well, it's a parody of itself. He is urging that somebody be impeached because he disagrees with their approach to the law. Is that what he said?
Basically, yeah.
Well, There is a definition in the Constitution of what constitutes an impeachable offense. It's a high crime and misdemeanor. That is, at a minimum, a gross neglect of duty. Simply disagreeing with Keith Ellison, I don't think amounts to a gross abuse of duty. The man is delusional.
Well, being an originalist and a textualist is apparently a high crime or a misdemeanor today, Judge Mukasey. That's how bad it's gotten. You heard Blumenthal and company. Judge, thank you so much. It's great to have you on, as always. And it's a 2020 presidential race showcase. So is Senator Kamala Harris the new Barack Obama? Back in a moment. California Senator Kamala Harris is becoming a shining hope for the hard left in the 2020 presidential race. Yes, we are already talking about that. Isn't that fun? We're 2018. We're already in 2020. Oh, MP is shaking her head. It's fine. And she has liberal heart swooning even more after a report that her office, check this out, refused to even accept a courtesy phone call from the White House counsel's office about, of course, the Supreme Court pick. They wanted, of course, to discuss the Kavanaugh appointment. Her office is now denying that exact, precise characterization. But regardless, Senator Harris is on a relentless campaign to beef up her left-wing bona fides. And it doesn't hurt that she's reportedly a longtime favorite of former President Obama's. But can she reach Obama-like status with the left? Here to discuss is Congressman Sean Duffy and Austin Dove, an attorney who's run in many of the same legal circles as Senator Harris. Great to have you both on. All right, Kamala Harris, I see her as a likely 2020 frontrunner. I don't think it's going to be Elizabeth Warren. I don't think it's going to be Bernie Sanders. Joe Biden is not going to resurrect the Amtrak Express. That's not. Hillary is not going to be with the Scooby-Mobile. That's not going to happen. It's going to be someone like Kamala Harris. Now, Mr. Dove, you know Kamala Harris. What about her versus Barack Obama? Are they of the same epic, star-like quality for the Democrats?
Well, other than the fact that it's kind of tried to say just because of their ethnicity is similar in terms of being biracial, they're obviously both from the Democratic Party. They're very strong candidates, but they come from different beginnings, different origins. Kamala's background was steeped in local politics first, then headed the district attorney's office in a very large county in California, in San Francisco area, and then became the state attorney general before becoming a senator. Barack Obama's background was much more grassroots, working with organizations before he came on to the political stride and gained traction as a senator, and popularity through his speeches and so on, his connection to the voters. I think in any sense, we want a candidate who resonates with the voters, someone who can connect, someone who has a strong background in policy, in lawmaking, and understanding how to work across the table in different circles. And I think Kamala is that candidate.
Austin. You lost me at work across the table. You were doing really well until you got to that point. And by the way, I raised her as a woman who's a former prosecutor, very strong background in the law as Obama. I don't think it wasn't anything about her ethnicity. It's about the fact that she has. It's about the fact that she has a pedigree and is now trying to push a more her left-wing bona fides, much more so than just her days as a prosecutor, which I think are really interesting. But let's talk about what she said today about Brett Kavanaugh. Didn't sound like she was interested in working across the aisle. Let's watch.
Listen, if you are a young woman in America, or you care about a young woman in America, pay close attention to this nomination. Pay close attention, because Kavanaugh has made his purpose clear. It's about government taking on the decision about a woman and what she does with her body, instead of giving that woman and her family and her God the power to make the decision for herself.
Okay, so Brett Kavanaugh is essentially, we're supposed to believe, Sean Duffy, standing at a Planned Parenthood abortion clinic and barring women from going in. That's what the woman who is the 2020, I think, likely presidential contender.
Laura, first, set that aside. I mean, the thing that Kamala Harris is talking about protecting women's rights. How about protecting a woman when she's in the womb as an infant? Someone who's the most vulnerable in any stage of life when they're in the womb. And I know that's not the debate we're having here, but the fact that you're talking about women's rights and not protecting women's rights in the womb is is outrageous. That aside, I think, and I think your intro is absolutely correct. When we talk about Kamala Harris and Barack Obama, it's not about race. It's not about their background. It's about who can be radical, who can be a leader of the resist movement, who can be the biggest hater of Donald Trump. Because if you're a Democrat, there's no ideas, there's no policy that you can run on. It's just being a resistor. Not only that, but I think Democrats are so engaged in what's happening right now because if you can't win at the ballot box, if you can't win votes in Congress, you have to look to the courts to have activist judges that will implement your progressive liberal socialist policies for you, because you can't do it in Congress and you can't win the hearts and minds of voters. And so you want to have the activist court initiative, and you also have, who's going to lead the resist movement. And Kamala, I think, fits both of those, or Senator Harris, I should say, fits both of those narratives.
Now, Austin, I remember the comment that Barack Obama made not too long ago about Kamala Harris, and this is why people still today say, of all the people out there, possible people running in 2020, she's probably his favorite. Let's watch.
I'm out in California. We're at a fundraiser. We're having a nice time. I happen to mention that Kamala Harris is the best-looking attorney general in the country. As you might imagine, I got trouble when I got back home. Who knew Eric Holder was so sensitive?
Haha. Well, I thought we weren't supposed to objectify women who went to prestigious law schools. I'm just teasing. See, I think that kind of humor is fine, but the left, Obama can make those jokes, but conservatives can't. But Austin, what's your thought here? I mean, is she the Kamala Harris, the tough-nosed prosecutor, or is she the Kamala Harris, if you care about women, then you have to stop Brett Kavanaugh? Because to me, the latter is just not going to resonate with Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
Well, I don't think those two are mutually exclusive, nor do I think the fact that being an attractive woman sort of excludes you from being politically adept and capable of being a leader the way Kamala has demonstrated.
No, I'm talking about commenting on it. Do you comment on people's looks, Austin, while you're... I mean, you probably don't, because that's just not... most of us in polite circles are told not to talk about that. I actually think it's funny. I think that's where Barack Obama is very charming, but the left never has a sense of humor on that. Conservatives do it, but that's beside the point. The point is Kamala Harris going to resonate with mainstream America, or is she going to stay in the resistance mode, fight Trump all the way?
Well, first of all, her comments about her thoughts about what's happening with women's rights coming up in certain swing decisions that will be taking place coming up, I think it's important for her to establish up front and say, this is where I stand on this. And I think that we're talking about a more than 40-year-old precedent that may be up on the block again. That's important for her to articulate that very clearly as well. As far as what her viewpoints are, can she gain traction, come outside of the resist mode as you've characterized it? I don't think that's where she really sits. I think as a former prosecutor, as you indicated at the outset, I think she's got strong chops there. I think she's got strong chops in lots of policy.
Lots of policy. You keep saying lots of policy. I'm not trying to be difficult here, but Sean, you're in Congress. What is the Democrats' agenda?
I'm talking about
what agenda do the Democrats have except stop Trump? They have zero agenda. So I'd love to hear the policy that Kamala Harris is advancing to get people more jobs, higher wages, et cetera, except raising the minimum wage in California. That's all she does.
It's single payer and a federal job for everybody. But we're talking about 2020. If you look at 2018, just one second. If you look at 2020 or 2018, you can't energize Democrats any more than they already are. This Supreme Court issue is going to energize their right, and actually, we're going to gain seats in the Senate. You talked about this. We actually might gain House seats because you're energizing the right
optimistic,
because of what's happened in the Supreme Court.
All right, Austin, you can close it out real quick.
Well, I would beg to differ. Your other guest own state, Wisconsin, that's shifting very much blue as a result of the very things that he's talking about right now. So those are up on the blocks.
Yeah, the pollsters said Hillary Clinton was going to win as well. The pollsters are wrong.
All right, guys, we're out of time. We're out of time, but I will say this. The Democrats at some point have to offer an affirmative agenda beyond single payer, abortion in every pot. I'm sorry, but we got to have more. We got to have more than just hate on Trump.
Those are real policies that have a real impact on the voters today, and they will matter.
Okay, well, I hope we hear a real substantive debate. President Trump, by the way, is taking the America First idea to the world stage. How he's planning to make sparks fly at tomorrow's NATO summit. Can't wait to watch after this. President Trump is now in Belgium for a two-day NATO summit that begins tomorrow. Now, President Trump has escalated his America First rhetoric and criticism of NATO ahead of this big meeting, and that's not sitting well with many European leaders.
I would like to address President Trump directly, who, for a long time now, has been criticizing Europe almost daily for, in his view, insufficient contributions to the common defense capabilities. Dear America, appreciate your allies. After all, you don't have that many.
I still don't get it, I don't think. We're joining us now, Matt Schlapp, chairman of the American Conservative Union, and Mike Fuchs, who's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. All right, Mike, you take it away here. A big meeting, NATO. Obviously, the president has made it clear that he wants the NATO member countries to pay up their old dues that they still haven't paid and pay the 2% required GDP. Most of them are nowhere near that. Germany's paid 1% GDP. Why is that a bad idea?
Well, it's not a bad idea. I mean, if you look at it, and actually in recent years, NATO has actually been increasing its expenditures. Member countries have in recent years, and that's a good thing. Past presidents have asked for the same thing. My issue with what President Trump is doing is that he's basically throwing the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to NATO. He is saying that NATO, maybe we don't need it anymore. Maybe it's not useful to us right now because they're not paying their dues as he calls them.
Because I think the last big speech he gave, he reinforced the importance of NATO, which was a relief to many of the global elites. They're like, well, at least he said that. So I think he said how important NATO alliance is, and he wants it reinvigorated, but he wants it to be fair.
Well, no, and I think what he's said repeatedly, frankly, since the campaign is actually that our NATO allies are not pulling their own weight and they're not doing enough, and that's not true. If you look at it, actually, even if you talk about the finances of it, NATO bases save American taxpayers dollars.
Why did Obama say they should do more than
they pay for our bases? Because I think that it is not a bad part of a usual give and take with our NATO allies, talking about how we both need to be making sure that we're paying the right amount. But let's just remember, I just think it's important to remember when we talk about the finances here, NATO bases save American taxpayers dollars. They save American taxpayer dollars.
Matt Schlapp. That sounds reasonable.
Yeah, nobody's trying to say that there's something wrong with having these bases. What we're saying is that when these countries come together and they all agree they're going to spend 2% of their GDP on national security, they shouldn't get away with not doing it. They shouldn't get away with only paying 50% of that rate. If they're going to put their name on the dotted line and commit to this, then they have to do it. Let's face it, we all know it. America has for decades paid the lion's share of all these expenses with our allies abroad, with when we have these coalition operations, and the American taxpayer, the American voter is simply saying, hey, why can't you just live up to your agreement? And by the way, this is not just NATO. It has to do with tariffs and trade and all these things that allies have in common.
They have a $150 billion trade deficit right now with Europe. The president's addressed that a lot of money there to play around with. But also a social welfare state as vast as Europe's, all health care, national health care, that costs a lot of money. Maybe if they had a bit more of a free market approach to some of these grand entitlements that have a little bit more extra cash floating around to invest in their military. They're spending more, I think you're right. But I think most Americans watch this and they're like, gosh, that doesn't seem right. I mean, we spend an enormous amount. And I think we should, but they need to spend a little more. I want to play something Max Boot, who I guess he used to be a writer for the Wall Street Journal. Now he's just on cable television trashing Trump. And he's one of these people who's like, never Trump, hope Republicans lose in November. Okay. This is what he said when he watched President Trump landing in Belgium. Let's watch.
And as I watch these pictures, I just do so with this intense sense of unease and angst and foreboding, because this is really could potentially be a make or break week for the Western alliance, for American foreign policy, for the post-Cold War order. This could be the most momentous few days in American diplomacy in the 21st century, and we'll see to what extent the damage that he does over the next few days. But I can't imagine any benefit from this trip. The only question in my mind is, how bad is the damage going to be?
Always the optimist about Trump. Mike.
Well, look, I actually agree. I have a similar sense of foreboding that Max does here.
It's going to be okay.
Based on what? Well, I'm not so certain. I think that there's an issue here. For the last 18 months, I think the European leaders have done their level best to actually try to work with President Trump. And I think over the last few weeks, they've begun to show that, you know what? We are fed up. We're not going to be treated like this. We've come to your defense in the past.
Okay, let's see how long that lasts. Matt, real quick. We're almost out of time.
It's the apocalypse. We pulled out of the Paris Treaty. Brett Kavanaugh. We're going to make NATO pay its dues. Come on.
All right. Well, a new so-called fast-track immigration court, guys, for border crossers seems to be slowing things down a little bit. Details next. It really is hard to imagine more chaos coming to our immigration system, but somehow the government is managing to pull it off. Now, a new report from the San Diego Union Tribune reveals, quote, fast-track misdemeanor immigration court rolls out with confusion, tension. Well, the court is designed to streamline border crossing cases, but it appears to be creating some log jams instead. Is this what we have to resort to as Congress flails at solving this border crisis? Joining us now with reaction, immigration attorney Salman Nasseri. Salman, good to have you on tonight. Here's the problem that I think most people see that are outside the political world. They're just watching this unfold. When we have thousands of people, which we do every month, crossing our border illegally, not through the normal ports of entry, just crossing into our country illegally. Most people believe that releasing them into the country, catch and release, is a joke. And it just encourages more illegal crossing, which is very dangerous and not compassionate at all. But the fast-track court is not something that you think is fair. Why?
It's not, it doesn't give anybody due process. I mean, once you enter the United States, once you cross that land, whether you're a citizen or not, you have the same constitutional rights. You have the right to due process. You have the right to confront your cases. And as an attorney to advocate for these cases, it's extremely difficult when you're on such a short timeline because you're being given either credit for time served, which is usually a good deal, or, hey, let's try to fight your case. And now these individuals are making statements that could be adverse to their immigration interests down the road.
Right, but you don't have the exact same constitutional panoply of rights as you do if you're an American citizen and you're accused of a crime. We know that. It's a substantive due process right, but it's not exactly the same.